Hey guys, Matt here. Welcome to Mixthru for Pop number 2. This is going to be a funky pop tune featuring vocalist and producer Maya Vick off Oslo Records. It's a pretty awesome song. Now, unlike the other Mixthrus, I did mix this song before going through this, but I mixed it like a year and a half ago. So it's been a long time. I don't really remember what I did, so this is basically a fresh start for me. But anyway, if you're not familiar with this format, the idea is that I'm going to go from point A, which is no processing here, faders up, and all the way down to point Z, where we have basically a working master. And I'm going to try and do it in about 2 hours and hope for the best, which is challenging on pop tunes. So real quick, I'm going to go over my routing right here in the organization of the session. I'm not going to spend too long on it, but just to point a few things out. So the song is very much bass driven, so I have the basses right at the top, and then right underneath that I have the kick drums, because that's going to be the thing that I am balancing mostly with the bass. Underneath that I have my snares and claps. Below that I have my percussion like hi-hats and other ambiguous percussive sounds. Then I have my lead elements, synth elements primarily. I think there's a guitar in there as well. And then some additional elements that are synth bass that are just augmenting the record underneath that, including a live like weird Zoom mic recording thing, which is pretty cool. And then underneath that I've got my vocals. All of those are going to submix groups that are put down as files, and they all filter into a single submix channel. Now the other thing that I have done here is, if you look closely, you can see that the clip gain has been turned down. This is because when everything comes together, I don't like my mix to be going too far into the light green or yellow, depending how things are set. I give myself a lot of room to work because I like to be able to turn things up, 10, 20 dB if I need to. Well, maybe not 20, but I find that it's easier to give myself a lot of room right up front, turn up my monitoring really loud, and really loud meaning a conversational level, and then mix from there. So, okay, I'm going to play this record, and we are going to start figuring it out. Here we go.
Gonna make this nice and easy. So when you come, I want you to go home. That's what she said.
Let's jump over to the chorus. So my immediate impressions are that the record needs to be rebalanced a little bit to focus more on the low end and more on the drivey percussive elements, things like the kick and the snare, to give it a little bit more punch and power. And then the other thing is that the vocals are going to need a little bit of treatment to really sit in there. Otherwise, I think it's a fairly self-explanatory, straightforward record, and I think what I'm going to do is start by muting up everything. And then I'm going to start with my core element. I've got these basses. I'm going to start picking apart the basses, get a really nice interplay between the vocals and the bass, which I believe are the two things that are bringing this record together. Work in the kick, work in the snare, work in everything else. All right, let's get to it. So I'm digging that. I think that the two basses should combine to fill up basically the whole bass to lower mid spectrum, and even go into the like core mid range with like the metal tone of the bass strings on the guitar. So you can kind of hear how when I just have the bass going, it sounds pretty full, but when I bring in this other bass synth, it loses a little something. So I'm going to try a couple of different things. The first thing I'm going to do here is set up a trim plugin. Doesn't really make much of a difference, and that makes sense. I mean, these elements are not triggered to each other. They're sort of just being played freehand and coming out however they're coming out. So what I'm going to do is, first things first, I'm going to use a program called Pi. Pi is a plugin by Sound Radix, and what it does is it focuses on phase rotation so that it keeps things kind of working in phase at all times. So what I'm doing here is I'm assigning them both to the same group, and then I'm going to switch them only to internal so that they're only interacting with each other, and now I'm going to play it. So without it. With. And so that's not a huge difference, but the main difference there is that the bass guitar doesn't feel like it disappears quite as much when the two are locked together. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to craft the relationship between the two, sort of form a complementary thing. The bass guitar I want to really work into the primary bass range, which is where it's very strong, and the bass synth I'm going to focus more on the top and bottom, which is where that has a lot of presence. So I think it's apparent if you're monitoring with a sub, that there's sort of a little bit of a loose subtone to this bass guitar, whereas if I switch over to the electronic bass, the subtone's a lot tighter. So what I'm going to do is sort of try and carve around, and I'm going to do it cautiously because I don't want to just simply destroy the low end of the bass. That's not really going to sound good. But what I can do is I can tighten it up, sort of get rid of the excess frequencies, and this is one of those things where, like, if you have the ability to listen with a sub or with bigger speakers, it can really help because you'll get a clearer picture of the low end. Before and after it real quick. Let's see. I think I actually want to brighten up the bass with a shelf. So I really want to get those inflections out, like the pulling of the strings. I think that's really important to the foundation of the record. And one other thing that I want to do is I want to just bring the punch of the low end forward a little bit. So I'm going to grab a multi-band transifer thing here. This is Joey Sturgis plug. And I'm going to set the cutoff to maybe about 400 hertz, and I'm going to just boost up the attack. Actually, that might be better. So sometimes if I can't get this to work without it breaking up, I'll use something like the isotope alloy or neutron plugin. So I'll grab, let's go to isotope, neutron transient shaper. All right, and we will do 2 bands. So that basically takes care of like the bass and the first few overtones. Usually keep it on sharp mode, and I'm going to start bringing up the attack. Now, one of the interesting things about this bass sound, this stereo one here, it's got a lot of really cool tones in the dead center mid-range that are existing on the sides. So what I'm going to do is turn this into mid-side mode and just boost those middle tones that are around like 500 hertz to sort of give it like body on the sides. So now we have this really cool sort of scopic full image where everything is sort of distinct, but everything's also kind of running together. So it's very full, it's interesting, it's clean, but it's not overly clean. It's got punch and dynamics. So we're definitely getting into the right space here. So let's copy over our pi setting here, and let's turn this little snap sound up. So I just want to make that feel a little bit firmer. Right now it feels a little bit too one-dimensional and loose. So, like, there's that punch tone that's down in the sub-range that I think is getting lost, which is why it sounds pretty flat when we bring it in with the other basses. Yeah, so that sounds a little smoother. And then we're going to bring up, like, that sort of harder tone, which is somewhere in the mid-range. And if we want to get really fun, I can even add like a little hair of distortion to it, just to kind of give it a little bit of extra grit, a little bit of extra edge and attitude right where that hits. And I think that the reason we even have this track of just bass slaps, gated bass slaps, is to give it a little bit of extra edge and aggression. Maybe a little too thick, so I'm going to sort of edge the tone over toward the brightness and maybe turn down the output just a little bit and the drive down just a little bit. Yeah, that sounds pretty cool. All right, so to just quickly recap what we did, the weirdness of this EQ for the most part is just tightening up the bass synth and balancing it around our other bass. So that's what's happening here. Basically what's going on is we've got this primary bass range here around 120 hertz that I'm boosting up in the bass guitar, and then we've got the subtone that's kind of loose in the bass guitar that I'm kind of backing that off so it's not as present. What I'm doing in the synth bass here is I'm pulling up the sub. I'm sort of tightening the sub a little bit because it's a little bit loose in the very low region. I don't usually high pass basses, but sometimes when they get a little flubby or there's just a little bit too much in like the 40 hertz and below area, I'll take a filter from like 28 hertz or something like that and just kind of run off a little bit of that super sub, just because it helps things blend together at the end. I'm taking out a little bit of mid-range, which is making room for the bass guitar. That's the purpose for doing that. Like, the mid-range on the synth bass is not really as interesting to me as the mid-range on the bass guitar. And then the brightness is because I've got all these cool little, like, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh noises happening in the stereo field and across the stereo field. I'm boosting that up in the treble. The side boost is to kind of give body to the sides of the spectrum. The bass guitar itself is giving body to the mid-range in addition to the bass. But it's a mono source, so it's not really giving me any weight on the sides. So pulling up a little bit of that tone that's happening in the synth bass that has stereo content kind of gives it this fuller sound. And when we talk about trying to make something sound big, sometimes it's because we're making something sound large throughout the stereo field. This doesn't cut into our headroom. It's not going to affect how well we can compress the record without losing our transients and things like that. So it works out. All right, we've got a couple other little things here. I'm not sure what these are yet. Cool. Okay, so that's sort of more of an effect. I don't feel like it really is an integral part of the bass sound. I'm still going to move my pi thing over just because they are going to be interacting, but mainly what I want to do is, since this is a textural element, I'm just going to boost the crap out of the high end. Cool. Turn the corner down a little. And then just back it off a bit. Cool. Let's go over to the end where it seems like it's more present. Yeah, I really like that, actually. I mean, this is one of those things, it's a subject that I've talked about a number of times, but sometimes you have to not really worry too much about how much you might be boosting or cutting. So this boost here at 5.5K is almost 10 decibels, but it's okay. I mean, it's a bass sounds, and I want the texture. So it's, you know, basses don't have a lot of content in the high end. It's pretty gonna be rolled off even on a brighter bass. And because I specifically want that texture, which is up there, it makes sense that I'm doing a pretty large boost. All right, cool. So now that we've got that going, let's start bringing in these vocals and see what happens.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. 'Cause I'm no longer EO Snoop. Boy, it makes me quicker.
So what's going on with this voice is sort of an interesting thing, and this is a challenge that I think comes up, you know, reasonably often. So this vocal is bright and dark at the same time. When you listen to anything that isn't like an S or a T, it sounds like it's run off. But when we hear the S's and T's come in, like you can hear how much that S spikes. So what we want to do is we want to control this vocal in a number of ways. First of all, we want to control the dynamics in general. Then we really specifically want to control the high-end content alone using some kind of a multiband. And then we want to brighten the vocal overall. So this is how we're going to make this vocal pop without becoming harsh. And it's going to take a little bit of work. Because as you can see, you know, it's a pretty dynamic vocal. We have some pretty harsh spikes that are happening throughout. It has been compressed. There's clearly some compression going on, but it's gonna take a little finagling. So there's a lot of tone, like a lot of harmonic things going on in the voice.
And I just don't know what it is.
Like, there's a lot of already saturated quality to the sound. So I want to be a little bit cognizant of oversaturating the vocal. So to begin with, I'm actually going to use a very utilitarian compressor. And my choice for that is pretty much always the FabFilter C2 or the Sony Oxford Dynamic thing. Both of those are really cool. So for a vocal, I usually like a combination of the attack of the compressor to work between the attack and the knee. And I'm going to try and explain this as clearly and succinctly as possible. So the knee, when you set the threshold of your compressor, that's what's saying, okay, this level of amplitude is going to start my compressor working. What the knee does is it actually begins the compression at a lower level of amplitude. So if I set the knee to 10 dB, we're going to start getting compression action 10 dB below the threshold. So it's going to trigger a lot earlier, but it's not going to trigger with as much of a ratio. The ratio is going to it's going to increase toward our target ratio as it approaches the threshold, if that makes sense. What this means is two things. First of all, we get a more transparent sound because the compression is working over a wider part of the signal. The other thing is that it changes the attack constant, because remember that the quieter parts of the signal are happening at the earlier parts of the signal. So when we use a wider knee, like 10 dB, we're effectively speeding up how fast the compression is going to act. So if we want to have the feel of slow attack compression, we can set our attack to like 15 milliseconds, and we can turn our knee up. And that's going to create a faster action, but the sound of a slower compressor, if that makes sense. And this is pretty important for vocals, particularly like pop vocals in this style, because if we want a transparent compression feel, then we want to not have it, you know, the compressor going, huh, and jumping in really quickly. So I'm going to use those things to sort of, you know, go between those two ideas to get a knee setting and attack setting that works. And when I'm doing this, I'm going to turn the ratio up pretty high.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. 'Cause I'm no longer EO Snoop. Boy, it makes me quicker.
I think for learning purposes, this sort of sucks actually, but I think I kind of got it right off the bat. But I'm going to turn the attack really fast just so you can hear the difference.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. 'Cause I'm no longer EO Snoop.
You hear how it feels like it's being choked right now? Like, the attack and the knee are making it work so fast that it almost feels like the singer is being strangled. So now I'm going to start slowing the attack down. Keep the knee where it is.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
And now it still feels like the vocal is breathing. It's not as dynamic.
I just don't know what it is.
But you can feel how that feels too dynamic, like it feels too up and down.
I just don't know what it is.
And then I'm going to speed up the release, and basically, with a pop vocal, I almost always want the release to be basically as fast as I can get away with very little exception. And what this is going to, this is almost like a front to back control. The faster the release is, the more forward the vocal is going to feel.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. 'Cause I'm no longer E.O. Snoop. Boy, it makes me quicker.
Cool. Turn the oversampling on.
I just don't know what it is.
And I'm going to back off the ratio. I think a pretty high ratio is going to work because this vocal is pretty dynamic. But, you know, obviously 30-to-1 is pretty hard.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. 'Cause I'm no longer E.O. Snoop. Boy, it makes me quicker.
But now we've got a nice controlled vocal. Now, I might do further compression down the line depending on how dense the record is getting, depending on, you know, maybe I want the compression to create an effect or something like that. But right now we're sort of doing the repair work. Maya has a very difficult voice because of the way she sings. She sings in a very breathy, airy kind of way. She sings very close to the mic, and it's a stylistic thing, but it is challenging to work with. So the next step here is going to be using some split band processing to just sort of keep the high end in check.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. 'Cause I'm no longer E.O. Snoop. Boy, it makes me quicker. I just don't know what it is.
So I'm going to be before and after that, and if your response is, well, gosh, this seems like some overkill on the de-essing, I'll explain why that's okay in a moment.
I just don't know what it is. I just don't know what it is. I know.
So that S really does sink away when I do this. Now, the reason why that's okay is exactly this. I touched on this before, but basically the high end of the vocal is out of balance. It's too dull when there's no S's and T's in, and then it's too bright when the S's and T's show up. So what I'm doing is I'm over de-essing the signal, and then I'm going to boost the high end overall to make the whole thing sound better. So, okay. Now I'm going to grab one of my favorite EQs for pop vocals in general, but this is just a great EQ. This UAD Mag 4, pretty awesome. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up to 20 hertz. Sometimes I'll do 40, sometimes I'll do 20, but basically what I do is I've heard the sound now, and I picture it in my head. And the way I hear it is it sort of starts rolling off at around like 4K, which is pretty low. So that's going to influence where I set this corner frequency to start boosting signal up. Like if, you know, if the vocal started running off at like 6K, then maybe I would boost from 40 hertz and I would just pump tons of top end in from that. But being as low as 3 or 4K where it starts running off, I'm probably going to choose like 20 or 10 to start bringing the high end forward. And I'm going to start with 20.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
Try 10.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
So it's kind of tough because what I really want is like 15. 15 kilohertz would be a perfect corner frequency here. When I do 10, what I hear is the upper mid-range start to get a little bit pushy.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
When I set it to 20, I feel like I want a little bit more of it.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
So I'm going to try and adjust a little bit more.
I just don't know what it is.
No, it was better before. I'm going to try pulling this up by maybe half a dB or so.
and I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing, 'cause I'm no longer eat or sleep. Boy, it makes me quicker. It makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers.
Okay, I'm digging that. I mean, it definitely still needs a little bit of work, but overall, I feel like it's going in the right direction. The other thing that's going on with this vocal is that it needs consistent body. So I might work in some kind of a parallel compression thing that focuses more on the low end of her voice.
And I just don't know what it is. And I just don't know what it is.
Like, and you can also kind of hear how the room is interacting with the low mids of her voice, which is going to make things a little bit challenging too. So I'm going to see if I can get really nuanced with her vocals.
And I just don't know what it is.
Like, you can hear a little bit of this mid-range tone showing up, and it sounds like it's maybe around like 400 hertz, which is, it's tough because that's where the body of her voice is going to be too. So it's like we have to really pick and choose how we're going to set her voice.
And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
So 350 hertz. And one way to really show what's happening is to, when I boost it, first of all, it becomes very apparent to the ear that that tone whoop, kind of flies forward, but you can also see it over trigger the VU meter graphic that's built into this EQ. So those are two things that are telling us, like, okay, this is where that room tone is really accentuating the voice. So I'm going to back this off until it no longer bothers me and it starts to feel clean.
And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
It's pretty good, so I'm going to boost this up a little bit to compensate for the tone change.
And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
Now there's a couple of other sort of not so great tones that are kind of in there that we're going to have to be a little bit careful with. There's something that's around like 800 hertz that's kind of like a beep type of thing. Yeah, you can quote me on that. And the upper mids have a little bit of harshness as well, and it's sort of hard to determine if I want to handle this with multiband, if I want to do this with straight EQ. I find if I can get away with doing it with straight EQ, it's almost always better.
And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. And I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. And I just don't know what it is.
So those upper mid-range things, I think I'm going to need to probably handle the upper mid-range in a different way just because it needs that presence there. Like, the capture is a little on the thin side, so if I start taking out stuff in the upper mids, it's not going to cut through the record. I think I can get away with what I took out at like 775 and what I took out at 350 with the boost compensation. So before it sounded like this.
And I just don't know what it is.
After.
And I just don't know what it is.
And so you can hear how, like, we hear more of the voice when I make these cuts. We hear more of the pop because more of the upper mid-range is weighted into the sound as opposed to, you know, it being pretty even across the board. So it's subtle stuff, but it makes a difference. And I'm doing about 5 dB of reduction here at 350. I'm doing a little less than 3 over at just around 800. And so these aren't really small changes, but they are not perceived as huge changes. And now let's bring it in on the record.
And I just don't.
Yeah, here's before.
And I just don't know what it is.
After.
And I just don't know what it is.
So this process of like cutting away the things that sound gross and then boosting up the signal afterwards is how you make these pop vocals sound really bright and poppy without them sounding like overly harsh or like you've forced a whole bunch of top end into it. And it's also worth pointing out that this EQ in particular, this mag, has a very, very broad slope. So if you're using a different EQ, you know, I'm using very wide shelves to boost the signal up, and so that sounds a little bit more transparent and a little less harsh usually than using tighter shelves. There are places to use tight shelves, but you know, this is a good place not to.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
So now what I want to do is maybe experiment with a little bit more dynamic control, either some de-essing or some compression or both, just to kind of glue it all together, because it is still a little bit loose, it is still a little bit thin feeling. So I'm going to start with the UAD 1176. There we go. And I find that this particular plugin for the 1176 sounds very good on pop vocals, male or female, whereas many 1176s, both the actual hardware and software, do not sound as good. So it's just something to keep in mind. This is not one of those things where necessarily every 1176 is going to work.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
It adds a little bit of grit, and remember when I said that there's already this sort of slightly oversaturated quality to the vocal? I think this is making it a little bit too colorful. So I'm going to go back to using things that are a bit more transparent.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
There we go. Now it's feeling like it's starting to glue together a little bit.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. 'Cause I'm no longer eat or sleep.
So now I'm going to de-ess it further because it needs it. This time I'm going to do some wideband de-essing that'll make it a little bit smoother, because I like the tone of the top end. I don't want to change it too much.
I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing. 'Cause I'm no longer eat or sleep. Boy, it makes me quicker.
And I think that's a good place to move on from now. Like, I'll probably need to figure out a way to get a little bit more body into her voice, but I think in general this is sounding pretty good.
Longer eat or sleep. Boy, it makes me quicker.
Might also throw a limiter on at the very tail end just to kind of catch some of the peaks that are happening.
Longer eat or sleep. Boy, it makes me quicker. It makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers.
A little less top end.
Longer eat or sleep.
And a little more overall gain. Just a touch.
Longer eat or sleep. Boy, it makes me quicker.
Yeah, that's once I do a little bit of parallel compression on that voice, I know it's going to sound really good and it's going to come really far forward and be pretty awesome.
Longer eat or sleep. Boy, it makes me quicker. It makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers.
So when this record originally came, it had just this Lindrum kick. I decided to incorporate a 707. And I think ultimately what I did in the original record was actually get rid of the Lin kick entirely. Yeah. I think I actually took their original kick out. And now what I want to point out here is, as a mixer, a lot of times I will opt to either augment sounds with my own layers or completely remove a producer's sound and put in my own sound. And I want to put a big asterisk around that. When you do that, you're opening a can of worms. First of all, producers usually spend a lot of time on their sounds. Even the ones who are sort of rushing through things tend to be pretty precious about their sounds, and they should be, because it's their music. So when you decide to change a sound in a very fundamental way, you have to acknowledge that you are changing the producer's vision to a certain extent. Or you have to do it in a way where you are preserving the original vision. And I think that the intention behind choosing this Lindrum was a really good one.
Kiss me shivers. And I don't even know.
It's got a certain bounce to it. It's got a cleanness to it and a bounce to it that I think really works for the record. However, I just don't love the sound. It's not bad, but it feels a little thin to me. Now, here's the 707. It's a little bit knockier, it's a little bit denser, so it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty darn similar. And my reasoning was, what I want is for this sound just to be a little bit less bouncy and a little bit more edgy.
Boy, it makes me quicker.
So, original kick.
Boy, it makes me quicker.
And our 707 level matched.
Boy, it makes me quicker. It makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. And I don't even know who to blame.
Well, so there is a sort of bounciness that I do really appreciate from the original Lin, and if I can work with it, I certainly will. So I'm gonna try and give that a go first. Basically, what I'm hearing is that it really just needs a lot more body. So I'm going to take Decapitator, keep it on the A setting, make the tone pretty dark. So what I did was I really pushed the low end into some distortion, and that's creating a denser tone that's happening in the bass range and lower mid range, mostly in the bass range, and then I'm using this mix knob to blend my distortion in parallel. So I created this sound, just really thick, really distorted, really crunchy, but has like no bounce to it, and then I blend it in so that it's mostly the dry sound with a little bit of that. And here's how it sounds in the record.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shiver.
Before.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shiver.
After.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers.
Not bad. Here's my 707.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers.
I gotta be honest, I just like the 707 better. I think that it fits into the record a little bit more efficiently. And then I've got a couple of other kicks here. I've got this new jack kick.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss.
So originally we sort of had this idea going.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers.
First of all, those two kicks don't really get along that well. The new jack kick gets along better with the 707.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers.
But I'm also not totally 100% sold on that new jack kick, so I have another kick that I've dubbed in, which is my buddy Paul from Morchiba. He made a really awesome kick and snare kit and hi-hat kit that he gave it away on Gearsluts, and he easily could have been selling it because it is fantastic. So that's the idea of this layered kick, is to give it real sound in a real room and make it feel acoustic as opposed to like strictly a drum machine. So instead of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to contour that kick to sort of function more similarly to how the new jack kick is functioning. So first of all, let me just play them both together.
Scream Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers.
So here's the New Jack kick.
Scream your name.
Here's the Paul's kick.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers.
The difference is that there isn't really as much going on in the top end in Paul's kick here. So I'm going to grab an EQ. And the other thing is that the reverb tail is a little bit long, so I'm going to throw on a gate as well.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers.
Now we have this nice, it's roomy, it's tight, it's doing kind of all the things that we wanted to do. So, New Jack kick.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers.
Not bad. With Paul's kick.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers.
So when talking about the producer's original vision, this was the original vision.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. And I don't even know.
And here's what we came up with.
Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers.
So you can kind of hear that I haven't changed the vision. Like these drums, like it literally sounds like I could have just done some really cool processing on the original drums and somehow gotten here. And I think that's a very important takeaway from when we're replacing sounds, that we have to do it in acknowledgement of what the intention of the original sound was if we are going to replace it at all, which I think should come at a later stage after we mess around with the sounds that we were already given. We should start by assuming that those are correct. And then I also created a reverb here. Just because I felt like this kick could use a little bit more texture, and all it is the kick being filtered and then sent through a mono reverb, nothing else. So it's not like there's any kind of magical technique here going on. And we're going to throw this gate on. We're going to create a gated kick reverb as well. And the reason why the gating is cool is, first of all, it gives it more of that 80s thing, and this is obviously a reference to like Prince era 80s funk. Also, when we have the gate on the reverb here, it allows us to push the reverb more if we want to. And if we can't really swamp the low end with reverb, that's going to suck. But if we gate it, it keeps it tighter and we can push more into it. And we could probably actually lower this ratio quite a bit. Cool.
Boy, it makes me quicker. It makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. And I don't even know who to blame.
Can actually hear that reverb quite a bit still. Get the release a little faster.
Boy, it makes me quicker. It makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, you kiss me shivers.
Cool, I like it. So, alright, let's start bringing in some of our other elements here. We've got some snares, we've got some claps, we've got some other snares, we've got some other claps. So let's figure out what really is going to hold this down.
What it is, I know it can't be nothing. 'Cause I'm no longer EOS.
So that's a cool layering snare, I think, but I don't think that's our main one.
I know we can't be nothing, 'cause I'm no longer eat or sleep. Boy, it makes me quicker. It makes me want.
That feels more like what we're going for.
'Cause I'm no longer eat or sleep. Boy, it makes me quicker. It makes me wanna scream your name.
Cool, digging that for sure. These two snares are working together really nicely. I think I'm going to do a little bit of EQ on the mid-range here just to kind of make it feel a little firmer in the lower part of the snare and have a little bit more, just a little bit more accentuation on the transient.
Makes me shivers. And I don't.
Well, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't actually need a little bit of brightness. It's pretty bright to begin with.
Makes me shivers. And I don't even know who to blame.
So with this far clap, meaning the one that has a lot of reverb, it's supposed to sort of startle the listener a little bit.
'Cause I'm no longer eat or sleep. Boy, it makes me quicker.
So it's supposed to wake the listener up and keep them with the song.
Boy, it makes me quicker. It makes me wanna scream your name.
So overall, I really like the sound of these snares coming together. I think that tonally speaking, it's a little bit loose. And what I mean by that is that it almost sounds like white noise. It's covering too much of the spectrum. So we're going to tie it up. We're going to cut out a lot of low-end stuff that we don't necessarily want. We're going to carve up a little bit of the mid-range, and we're going to make the sound a little bit more focused. And you can see, like, right on this analyzer, there's a ton of low buildup in here. And, you know, it shows up on the subs, but, I mean, you might not hear it on smaller speakers because a lot of it is, like, sub-60 stuff, but we really don't need that for this sound. And so, like, for the main content of the sound, which is, like, above 250 hertz, you'll notice that this EQ hardly makes a difference. It just gets rid of a lot of bass tone. Now, this is sort of the same deal. Like, you can actually hear it where there's, like, subtone in this snare. And we don't need the subtone, but we do want bass tone. So we want to negotiate the low end a little bit. Actually, that sounds pretty good, just right off the bat. Okay. So one of the things that's happening is that by reconstructing the snare, even though we're just doing reductive EQ, I've pointed this out a few times. Just because we're removing content doesn't mean that we're going to gain headroom. This is a very common misconception. It's understandable. You think if you're subtracting tone, we must be losing amplitude overall. However, what people don't realize is that an EQ it revolves around something called a reconstruction filter, where the sound comes back together and reforms its shape. So watch the meter here. Notice how much more it spikes forward. And if you look at this, you realize, wait, I'm only subtracting tone. How could I possibly have this spiking forward? And it's because this is how an EQ works. So I'm going to switch this into, I could do this two ways. I could either add some compression, lower the volume, or I could use linear phase EQ. And actually all of those could work. Let me bring these back together. I think linear EQ is going to be a better choice. That works. So the reason why I ended up going with the linear EQ there is because listen to what happens to the low end of the snare when I bring in my EQ and how they interact. Now linear phase. It's a tighter sound. Huh. However, I don't know. It kind of sounds better actually with in the entirety of the mix, so I'll probably keep it that way. So cool. I'm going to take off these settings. Put them back on. I think I want to do a little bit of EQ on that far clap too. It's just a little bit of weird room tone. So I'm going to leave it like that, actually. I like the way that it sounds. Now, I'd like to point out that through this process of taking out a lot of these low-end tones, it's tightening up the sound, but I'm not gaining any headroom, quote-unquote. I've actually lost headroom, but it's okay because I think that the way the sound is working is actually really good. And if I want to gain some headroom back, quote-unquote, if I want to be able to make the record louder at the end of the day, I'll figure out another way to do it. But ultimately, what's most important is that the groove is feeling right, and I think that this is an improvement. So I'm going to take off all these EQs. Actually, let's put that down like that. And now I'm going to bring them back on. Purely subtractive EQ. One more time. Just tighter and cleaner sounding, and I am going to add that little bit of gain back in. Cool. Let's move on. We've got a couple other things going on here. We've got some percussion sounds here, some hats. So this metal fried hat is a really cool sound. They ran it through like some kind of a delay or a flanger or something like that. There is a tone that's sort of annoying me a little bit that's in like the very, very top end, which I'm going to kind of try and suck out. So before. After. Now, if you were saying that is a damn subtle difference, then you are correct. But it's a textural difference. What I'm hearing is in the high end, it felt a little bit harsh and not so smooth. And if I wanted a trashier sound, I think it would be fine. What I'm trying to do is polish it up. And there's a harsh tone that's sort of getting in my ear that I don't really like. So I'm taking that out. It's around, looks like it's about 8.3K. And I've taken out a little bit over 5 decibels, very narrow Q, and then I've boosted the rest of the top end to give it a little bit of that shine. And so now it sounds a little shinier and more polished, but it's not aggressive. And I usually have been mixing my hats fairly loudly these days. I feel like a lot of that like 70s to early 80s funk stuff has come back in vogue, and so we're hearing louder hi-hats in general, and they were, you know, like if you listen to like Bill Withers records or you know, oh my god, how am I blanking on the guy who did Love and Happiness? Oh, I'm gonna get flamed for that. But his hi-hats are very loud. I'm having such a brain block. That's so annoying. His hi-hats are very loud. Al Green. Okay, there we go. His hi-hats are very loud, and that style is sort of happening again. So we have a few options when we have multiple hi-hats. And I go back and forth on this idea all the time. But the concept is, do I put them together? Where they form a glued rhythm? Do I keep them in separate parts where maybe one locks down the center and one is panned out? Or do I pan them apart and create a really wide image? And the answer is that all of those work, which is frustrating because then it's a matter of which one works best. And so we ask, well, what are they really doing? Well, they're going to affect the dynamic and the groove. That's really the main consideration here. When I pan them together, it becomes one cohesive line. When I pan them slightly apart, where our one hi-hat is off to the left a little bit and the other one is dead center, there's when it hits certain notes, it pulls the ear back to the center, and so it creates a new sense of dynamic. It's a different rhythm that's happening effectively. And when I pan them apart, they become very separate. Now, to my ear, that's actually a little distracting. Yes, it's a wider image, but I feel like it's taking away from the groove a little, and it's sort of pulling my ear in two different directions, and I don't think that that really is going to work for the song. So my next step here is going to be to pull in the percussion, and I think that's going to also inform the rhythmic decisions that are going on with the hi-hats here.
Get a fire, bring
I think with the percussion in, because it sort of straddles the sides a little bit, I can probably pan the hats out and it'll stay kind of cohesive now that that percussion is in. Yeah, so that kind of works, and I'll take the percussion out real quick, and you'll see how it feels like suddenly this is two separate. Amazing how that stuff kind of works. Anyway, let's bring in these little fills here. Maybe let's also just lower the submix just a touch because it's starting to get up there. Cool. Okay, so let's start. We could go two directions from here. We could either build an ambience around the vocal and maybe like really bring the vocals home. We could firm up the low end a little bit more, or we could just start getting the other elements in. I kind of want to do the vocals. So let's create some auxes and get these color coordinated here. So this is going to be tight plate. And this is going to be dynamic delay. Cool. I'll assign some buses. We'll do this as our tight plate. And this will be our dynamic delay. So what I want to do is I want to have a bit of a tighter ambience around the vocal to just make it feel a little bit depthier and give it a little bit of polish. And I also want to have a delay that's coming off of the vocal lines, and I want to have it be like maybe sort of an interesting delay, like some kind of a modulated delay. So let's start with the tight plate. So I'm going to take the timing of the bass and mids down. And raise up the pre-delay here. Now we are going to just make less of it. Cool. Alright, so for this one, I'm going to use the air dynamic delay. Set it to quarter notes. Like that there. There's actually a nice preset that makes life a lot easier. It says only while silent. It'd be good to get the tempo as well. So it's kicking in a little too early, so I'm going to slow it down a bit. I'm going to put a chorusing effect on there, something to kind of flange it out. This is a good one. EQ here. Let's take out a lot of the low end. Turn it down. And throw the delay to the reverb. Maybe roll off a little bit of the top end too. Cool. All right, let's try and get this vocal to feel a little bit more consistent. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to duplicate the lead vocal track. And for one thing, scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shiver. So I'm going to use, first of all, I want the 1K range to just be more consistent, because I just need that to cut. So I'm going to grab the FabFilter Multiband Dynamics here. Makes me wanna scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shiver. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. Makes me wanna. And the default positions are usually pretty good for vocals. Like, what I'm basically trying to do is I'm trying to take the 1K range and make it sort of lock into place so that it's centered in 1K consistently, because that's going to help the vocal feel like it's full in the mix more than anything else. It's going to help it translate to a lot of different systems. It's going to help it poke through on laptops, but it's not going to be harsh. It's not the harsher upper mid-range that allows things to cut through. So again, you know, it's sort of working with this very, very dynamic vocal and making sure that it's going to stick. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. And I'll just try the minimum phase. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. Makes me wanna scream your name. Actually tend to like the minimum phase a little bit better. To me, it's a slightly tighter, cleaner sound. Makes me wanna scream your name. It's not like quite as full 100%, but I mean, it's cleaner. So it depends on what you want, I guess. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, you kiss me shiver. But you see how much of a difference that makes immediately. So, okay, next thing I'm going to do is set up this parallel track. What I am doing here is I'm taking the exact same clone of the track, and I am, first of all, making sure that I'm not going to get delay from doing this and cause phasing by setting my buffer up, but I'm going to grab the 1176 that I tried before, and we're going to try it again, but this time in parallel mode. Scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. Makes me wanna scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. Makes me wanna scream your name, wow, boy, you kiss me shivers. Makes me. Cool. And what I'm going to do here is take the FabFilter DS. And we're going to cut out a ton of those S's.
Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers.
So what's going on here is that I'm using the parallel compression to basically make the voice thicker, but because I don't want the S's to jump forward anymore, I'm removing S's from the parallel return.
Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers.
Now this might make it overwhelm the record a little bit, so we might need to make some adjustments afterwards.
Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers. Makes me wanna scream your name. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers.
So there's like a little bit of extra tone in this now because of the saturation quality of the 1176. So somewhere in here, I'm going to just find an EQ where I have a free band, and I am going to try and get rid of a little bit of that tone that I don't like.
Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers. Makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers. It makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers. And I don't even know who to blame.
Well, I can always do it on the vocal channel itself too, which I probably is, you know, what I'll do.
It makes me wanna scream your name. Wow, boy, it gives me shivers. And I don't even know who to blame.
Cool, let's start working in some of this other stuff. Okay. We've got some really cool synths going on here. So it's a little tonally loose, a term that I've been using a lot lately. Take out some low. Right, see that low end build up again. Get rid of that. We probably don't need quite as much of that 1K tone. I kind of want to hear a little bit more of like the 3K, 4K stuff. I also want to hear a little bit more ambience around it, so I'm going to grab the FabFilter Timeless. And a lot of times I really just like the default setting. Not this time, though. Chorusing around it to help it kind of have a slight ambient quality. Like it's thickening it, it's modulating it, and it's also kind of helping to give it a bit of depth. I think I'm going to do now is I'm going to... I've got them all going to the same bus anyway. I'm going to go to my leads bus here, and I'm going to grab a compressor. I'm going to grab the UAD Fairchild, because it's got such a wonderful tone. Back off the input gain a little bit, turn the threshold up a little bit. Turn up the output a little. So, I'm going to play the before and after, and then I'm going to explain why I'm using a compressor on these synths. I'll do it from here. So here's my thought process. There's a lot of reverb that's built into these synths, and it's a good sounding reverb, so I think that the producers got it right. I just want to bring it out a little bit, so I'm using some compression to accentuate it. And now, why am I using compression as opposed to maybe using another reverb or, you know, doing some kind of automation or something like that? Well, because we can also highlight the synths by putting a little bit of tension on the sound, changing the shape a little, and rounding it out, and also because the tone of the compressor has a nice second harmonic overtone in this particular UAD plugin, and so I'm able to get a whole lot of things accomplished just by using one move, and I find that if I can do multiple things, you know, achieve multiple goals in one go, it's more efficient, and it works. It sounds good. Sounds good. Alright. So this is obviously not meant to be super heard in the mix, it's meant to be felt. Let's take out a lot of that low end.
Makes me wanna scream, yawn. Makes me wanna scream, yawn.
Now there's a lot of low end buildup in this sound.
Makes me wanna scream, yawn.
So when I put this gentle slope, the 6 dB per octave, and I set it at 250 hertz, which is very high for a high pass, understand that I'm using my ears here, I'm not judging by the numbers. I'm rolling off a ton of low end, but there's a ton of low end there.
Makes me wanna scream, yawn. 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 Makes me wanna.
Makes me wanna scream, yawning. Makes me wanna scream, yawning. Another trick or something, and I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing, 'cause I'm no longer eat or sleep.
And a de-esser as well.
Another trick or something, and I just don't know what it is. I know it can't be nothing.
Cool. Alright, let's bring the low end home.
Another trick or something.
Let's grab our UAD compressor. That thing always seems to work really well. I think the kicks could use a little bit more low end overall. A lot of choices for what low end to use. I think I'm actually going to use the Air EQ. It has a certain tone to it that it's hard to put into words, but it's going to have the transparency that I want. Actually a little flubby in the mid-range in these kicks when they come together, so I'm gonna try and find where that flub is happening. There we go. Now the last thing that I want to do is I want this low end to be very thick and chewy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trigger some compression from the kicks so that there's a little bit of push and pull movement going on. And I'm also going to EQ the bass as a response and try and thicken up that like dead center low mid range. Set the side chain to external. Let's thicken it up. Now, there's a couple ways to create a thicker tone. One of the things that I've been liking is this Manny American tone shaper. And it's sort of a multi-band compressor meets saturator thing. Kind of hard to explain, but basically I'm going to center in this low mid band. Cool. Now we're going to bring everything else in. distortions can come up just a little bit. Let's bring in these backing vocals. Obviously, they need a little bit of work here.
Going insane, going insane, going insane, going insane, going insane, going insane.
Same sort of deal. There's a lot of S, but not enough top end in general.
Going insane. Going insane, 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 going insane.
So I'm also going to add a little touch of distortion here, just to kind of make the backup vocals pop. They're a little bit softer and rounder in their delivery and lower in tone, so they don't naturally have as much upper mid-range pop.
Going insane.
And throw the limiter on there.
Going insane.
This a little bit more because we're starting to run pretty hot. And turn the kick drum up just a little bit. There we are. Cool. So let's start bringing this home. We don't have too much here to finish up. So bring in this next synth. Just gonna throw on the channel without using a send. I'm gonna put a little bit of reverb on this. And just a little bit of distortion to kind of give it a little bit of color. I find that this E distortion really makes things pop in the upper registers, so it's pretty good for synth stuff. Probably want to take out a little bit of the low tones as well. So what else do we have here? We have a vocoder group.
Going insane. Get off my brain.
And we definitely don't need that much low end in this.
Get off my brain. Go. 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 Get off.
Get off my brain.
Go insane.
Get off my brain.
And we also have this cool little room mic thing here. So the record starts out with this. But I kind of like this weird sort of feature thing. Like, it's just like a zoom mic capture of whatever's coming out of the speakers or something weird like that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to compress the ever-living snot out of it. And then I'm going to EQ it as if it is the entire mix, basically. It's cool. It makes for like cool little fills. It's a really ingenuitive sort of thing. Something to sort of file into the memory banks, that if there's a record that kind of has something going on like this, that I can recreate that effect even if the producer doesn't provide it. It's sort of cool.
So guys, we're gonna make this night. So guys, we're gonna make this night for you. So when you come, I want you to go home. That's what she said.
So this vocal recording here,
So guys, we're gonna make this nice and easy.
I think that I don't want to really over-treat it. It's supposed to sort of sound really raw and like it's coming through a PA or something like that.
I want you to go home. That's what she said.
So one thing that I want to happen is all of this intro needs to be lower significantly than the actual song.
That's what she said.
snares and the kick could probably be a little bit bitier. Basically there, the bass could still be a little bit grindier. It could use a little bit, maybe some grit, some dirt. Probably also send these off to the vocals. Small detail. I want to bring out that ripping texture from that bass, that synth bass. Maybe not that much. This is going to the wrong bus. Go. And I think that I'm going to do that Sound Radix Pi thing on these leads as well, just to make them pop a little bit more, because they could be a little bit brighter and a little bit more vivid, and I think that the Sound Radix Pi is going to help that happen in a pretty smooth and transparent way. So I'm going to set these to their own group. Solo it up real quick. So here's without. Start a little earlier. With it. It just makes it a little bit more vivid. That could use a little bit more mid-range, I think. It's got a really nice color right in like the 500 Hertz area. And with this, I'm going to bring up some more side information. I think that it could be just a little bit wider. I'm going to switch this to mid-side. So we're going to turn the mids down a few dB and compensate by boosting up the output. A little more side. Same with that. this, I mean, that I could even do some kind of like a Haas effect to just make it straight up stereo, because it's meant to sort of augment the moment. Like, it's not a lead feature of what's happening here. So I think what I'm going to do is grab a delay, and, oh, I did multiple mono. Mono delay, there we go. And this is going to be dry, this is going to be wet, and we're going to do, let's do like a 25 milliseconds, see how that feels. And then balance it a little bit. Could also swap the image. Not so much. Or what we do is we set this to our, this probably needs to be a little bit faster anyway, but set it to that. Let's see how this feels. That feels better. So here's without it. With it. And that cadence moment of the phrase really comes out when it's wider. It makes that bump, 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 like much more of a solid tag because there's so much more size to it when this becomes split. So what I'm doing is, by delaying the one side, the left side, by 15 milliseconds, it creates a sort of fake stereo thing that's happening. And because this is a background synth, it's not a lead synth, I'm not too worried about whether or not it's mono compatible or if there's now phasing between the two sides. Like, it doesn't bother me. We're not going to miss it in the mono fold. And then now I'm going to actually bring some weight into it, like some lower tones. Start from 400 and just turn it up. Yeah, let's see how that feels. We might need higher tones. Actually, what it really needs is both. It needs high tones and it needs low tones. Yeah, there we go. Alright, last step is the Prophet bass. Because we already have a ton of basses there, even though this is a bass, I should probably high pass it just so that it's not quite so cluttered. The end is supposed to sound a little weird anyway. So now what I'm going to do is sort of bring it home and turn this significantly down. And I'm going to try a couple different bus compressors just to kind of glue it together, give it a little bit of impact, see if I can make the tone come a little bit forward, like something that might accentuate the mid-range. So I'm going to pull up two compressors that I tend to like a lot, 33609. Bypass that. And I'm also going to pull up this UAD SSLG channel. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and get the best out of both of them and see which one I prefer at the end of the day. pretty easy to set up. I usually like the automatic setting, automatic 1. The other one that I'll tend to use will be the very fast setting. Like with the automatic 2 setting, it tends to be a little bit too slow for anything poppy. So usually I tend to use the faster stuff, either 100 milliseconds or the automatic. And when it's this little gain reduction, it's splitting hairs, but like if we dig into it a little bit more, well, actually, if we dig into it more, I think the 100 milliseconds is working better here. The automatic one is working too slowly, but at this point... It's actually tough. Like, it's the groove is more lively when I'm setting it faster. Like there's a little bit, the speed difference is making things kind of jump a little faster and it's giving it a little more energy. There's a nice sort of pulling thing going on when I use the automatic 1, and I think that's originally why I sort of gravitated toward it. Like it sounds a little smoother and it sounds like there's a bit more of this thick pull thing happening, but the case could be made for either and it's sort of splitting hairs. Like, it makes it sound a little bit brighter, too, when I use the faster recovery. Anyway, let's set the SSL and see what happens. So, just from A-Bing them very quickly, I think that the 33609 is better here, tonally speaking. The SSL is a little bit brighter, and it has a little bit more of, like, a hashy quality to it. And I think it's grabbing the kick a little bit more. The 33609 sounds a little rounder to me. It sounds like it's a little bit chewier and that there's a little bit more of this like sort of glowier quality that's going on. So I think I'm going to stick with the 33609. I think I'm going to make some very slight adjustments to the tone curve. I think that just a little bit of extra pop in both the top end and the treble range is going to be nice. Yeah, just a little bit of like 700 hertz to kind of give it a little bit more body. kind of sounds about right to me, actually, so that's probably good. So the very last step is going to be to throw on a limiter. And I like the FabFilter L. When I'm doing this, I usually hold down the shift when I boost up the gain so I can start hearing it level matched to determine where there's too much compression and where there isn't too much compression. So we're not getting any distortion at this point, and we're not losing too much bounce. We do lose a little bit of sense of the bounce in the low end. So I want to make some adjustments to see if I can retain more of that while getting it pretty loud. Pop music, generally, people ask for it to be pretty loud, so this dynamic setting will help. And setting this attack to be a lot slower usually helps as well, and setting the lookout as low as I can get away with will help as well. Okay, so this is gonna get loud. I'm gonna start backing this output back up to finish this off. And so this is going to really kind of bust through the speakers pretty loudly. So if you're listening and you've got your speakers turned up loudly, you know, take a second, hit pause, turn your speakers down, and here we go. Okay, you can turn your speakers back up because we are basically done, and I'm gonna touch on one last little point here. I might have been overloading ScreenFlow when I did that too, because that's what I'm recording on too. So if a little bit of crackling showed up, just know that there's no crackling on this end, and you're also going to have this print in the Mixthru package, so you'll be able to listen to it on your own system separately, and of course you'll have the stems as well, so you can kind of mix along, you know, emulate what I did or even top what I did. I'm just going to recap some of the ideas here real quick. You know, one of the things that I used was the dynamic delay, and what the dynamic delay does is it reacts to the incoming level, so that when the vocal is out, the delay will come up. When the vocal is in, the delay tucks down and ducks away. You can do that. There's a lot of ways to do that. You can do that by triggering a delay throw. You can do that by riding a delay return, and then I'm putting a bit of modulation onto the delay itself, so it sort of flanges a little bit. You can do this with any kind of, you know, it doesn't have to be the FabFilter Timeless Ensemble Chorus. I just happen to like that setting. But you can do it with any kind of chorus, flanger, phaser. Like, it's basically to create a little bit of texture and movement within the delay and give it like a sort of slightly surreal throwback-y quality. So that's something that I wanted to touch on. Once I got the bass and kick more or less working, that didn't mean that I was necessarily finished. That was so that I could get everything in place, and then once everything was in place, then I could kind of hammer things out, and I decided, you know, the bass needed a little bit more grit, it needed a little bit more thickness to it, so I did a few things on the bus here. I also triggered it from the kick, and this is not to make clarity. The kick and the bass were already pretty much getting along, like there wasn't a lot of interference. It's not like I needed to duck the bass out of the way of the kick in order for the kick to be heard. I mean, yes, that does happen as a result, but it's more for the fact that I wanted a little bit of that pulling motion to start to show up. I find that with low-end stuff, I almost always, and not always, but like 90% of the time, I want some kind of interaction between the kick and the bass. I want it usually from the very start of the record, like when the players are tracking. Like a lot of times I will record the drummer and the bass player at the exact same time so that they can react to each other just as a natural thing, and then in the processing, you know, make sure that either the kick and the bass are going to a compressor together, or, you know, the bass is in some way, shape, or form being compressed by the kick, so it's ducking out of the way, or that there's some kind of homogenizing, like distortion or tone or saturation thing going on. Just something where the low end all kind of plays together and works off of one another. I find that that's really important in anything that's dance-oriented at all, not just pop, but like EDM and everything like that. The vocals, again, I got them to a nice place, and I sort of said, okay, once they're at this certain spot, it's only a matter of just making them feel consistent and full. And so once I got them to that point, a little bit of the multi-band to keep that 1K, the center, the warm center of Maya's voice locked in place. And as you can see, I'm doing a fair amount of compression. My band range is down like -11 dB. It's not doing -11 dB of compression at any point. It's only doing like, you know, 3 to 6 at the most, but I'm also boosting up that range by about 4 decibels. So it, you know, it's 4 dB more locked in place is effectively what's going on. And then I have the parallel compression underneath it, which is helping it stay forward and giving it a little bit of extra fullness and body as well. So those are some other things that happened. When it came to all these background vocals, it was very quick because I basically just copied over settings from the main vocals, didn't really need too much outside of that, and also because of the nature of them, like, letting them be a little lo-fi and a little bit raw I think is okay. And then the other thing is just, you know, not being shy on some of these fill moments where, you know, these little bass stabs are coming up. Like, yeah, they can overwhelm the entire record at the same time, or when they come in, and that's okay. They're supposed to do that. They're supposed to sort of wake the listener up, and that's really important in pop music. Every moment should be kind of exciting the listener and getting them to go like, oh, that's cool. You know, I want to dance to this. I'm getting energy from this. So I hope that you guys learned something. You know, grab the stems or grab the track outs, mix along. Yeah, beat my mix. I believe in you. And till next time.